This screencast is going to start with Chapter 31, the last of Unit 10. If you have not already done so, please pause the screencast and go to Moodle and download the Chapter 31 outline. We will begin with the year 1968, which we also covered during the Civil Rights Movement, because just as it was a tumultuous year for the Civil Rights Movement, it's also a tumultuous year kind of for the Vietnam War effort for several reasons, and so we're going to talk about that. Starting with the Tet Offensive, which is going to have a major impact on American support for the war effort. So, Tet is a week-long truce. Well, first off, let me say Tet is a holiday in Vietnam. It is the Vietnamese New Year. And all sides in the war, including the Viet Cong, had actually issued a truce to honor and celebrate the Tet New Year. A holiday for celebration, a break from fighting, but also a way to give some private and personal time for members of all sides to bury their dead and have funerals, which they haven't had the opportunity to do yet. So there is going to be many celebrations during this week-long truce, but also funerals. And the Viet Cong are going to take advantage of this opportunity to launch a surprise attack in South Vietnam, basically going behind the backs of the ARVN and Americans and breaking the truce. They are going to disguise themselves at different funerals in South Vietnam, kind of just pretending to be regular funeral goers and hiding weapons. And then they will basically launch a series of surprise attacks that last about a month. And they do this in cities across the South. And it is a complete surprise for the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, but they were able to gain control of those cities in about a month. The Viet Cong lost high numbers of soldiers in these attacks. Just for some statistics here, the Viet Cong had lost like 32,000 soldiers in this offensive, while the U.S. and ARVN had only lost about 3,000. So from that type of standpoint, it looks like an American and ARVN victory, that they were able to fight off the Viet Cong successfully, and Westmoreland will definitely declare it a victory for our side. But from a psychological...
Pardon the interruption.
Sorry for that interruption. An announcement came on. What I was saying is, from a psychological and political standpoint, even though Westmoreland is claiming it to be a victory for our side, it's actually a defeat. This is just showing that Johnson's administration is kind of lying about the fact that we are on the brink of winning and securing a win in this war, when in actuality the Viet Cong still keep throwing these surprise attacks and unplanned advances. And this is going to be the big event that's where American public support for the war starts shifting away, where they start opposing the war. Whenever all this involvement started, we saw the fact that just over half of Americans were supporting our involvement in Vietnam. And after the Tet Offensive and the surprise attacks from the Viet Cong, like less than 40% will support it, which is showing just a huge decline overall. All of this is going to be a burden on President Johnson, and he is actually going to choose to not run for re-election. Even though he was eligible for re-election, he chose not to run for re-election in the year 1968. Just the divided nation and the war itself just took too much of a toll on him. Okay, just want to say the bell is going to be ringing for our assembly, so it'll interrupt my screencast, but that's okay. Also, just kind of recapping this. There's the bell. Just kind of recapping this, but in the year 1868, it was very tumultuous for assassinations. Martin Luther King was assassinated. So was Robert Kennedy, who was running for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, which is going to come into play in a second here, so just hold on to that thought. But also in the year 68, college campuses are just continuing their protests, just like we saw at Berkeley. During the first 6 months of 68, almost 40,000 students on more than 100 different campuses took part in hundreds of demonstrations. Many focusing on like civil rights, but many others focusing on U.S. involvement in Vietnam and protesting that involvement. The last thing I want to talk about is some violence and disorder that took place at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Okay, I'm sorry for the chaos, but we are going to restart this section really quickly just because a student was walking in to cross into my class to get to the assembly as a shortcut. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Democratic National Convention, which is where the Democratic Party would officially choose the candidate for the Democratic nomination. So, like, all the Democrats were competing against each other. Kennedy had been one of those candidates, but again, he's been assassinated in 1968. So who is going to be chosen in his place? So the main two were Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey is Johnson's vice president. Pretty much he had it in the bag. Like, people knew he was going to be chosen. He had higher results in the primary polls. But McCarthy was very popular within anti-war movements. He has little chance to win, but he's still very popular amongst the youth and the people who are strongly protesting the war. When Humphrey's, sorry, someone's trying to get in again. When Humphrey's nomination was announced, there were thousands and thousands, like almost 10,000 protesters in Chicago who were mainly there to protest Humphrey's nomination. Humphrey's nomination over McCarthy. And violence is going to break out because of these protesters. It's mostly youth. It's actually the people who were protesting were mainly part of that SDS. That's the Students for a Democratic Society. So it's definitely the youth in the movement who are protesting. And again, they were wanting to have their other candidate be nominated, McCarthy. But what's going to happen is, because it's so many of them, Chicago is going to mobilize like 12,000 police officers and over 5,000 National Guard members to try to keep the peace and keep protesters under control. But we've already seen this happen. Sooner than later, order is just going to completely collapse, and the protesters are going to respond very violently. They're going to actually march on the convention, and the police will march into the crowd, spray the protesters with mace, beat them with sticks. Many of them flee, but many of them are still being beaten by the police, and once again, all of this is caught on camera. This is making the Democratic Party look so divided and disorganized that this is really going to hurt the party's image, and the party that will benefit from this is the Republican Party. And they had nominated, of course, Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon will easily win this election. We're going to continue with this idea of Nixon in power and what he does for the party and really for the war effort in class tomorrow. So please write down any questions you have, especially if you're confused with all the interruptions. I did the best I could, but I will see y'all tomorrow.